Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. Now, what connects Donald Trump's impeachment trial with a war half a world away? The answer is Ukraine. It has been back in the headlines recently, but its conflict with Russia, now more than 5 years old, feels like it has largely been forgotten. So what are the chances of bringing peace to Ukraine? This is Roundtable. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Ukraine's long war with Russia is dragging on. Its relations with the United States, well, a little strained, thanks in part to a now infamous phone call with President Trump. Last year's peace talks on the war in East Ukraine made modest progress. So is there a realistic path to peace?
A phone call back in July nearly cost Donald Trump his presidency. In it, he asked Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for a favour, an investigation into political rival Joe Biden and his son. It led to impeachment and pushed Ukraine back into the limelight of global politics. It also hit relations between the two nations, putting at risk humanitarian and military aid that Ukraine receives from the US. The US government has provided more than $1.6 billion in security assistance to Ukraine since 2014, when Russia illegally annexed the Ukrainian territory of Crimea and sent forces into East Ukraine under the guise of separatist protesters. The fighting there has killed more than 14,000 and devastated Ukraine's industrial heartland. During talks in Paris in December, the four leaders of Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany made a deal to exchange prisoners and pledged to ensure a lasting ceasefire between Ukrainian troops and Russia-backed separatists. But progress on key political issues remains to be seen, which has many asking whether Ukraine has become a frozen conflict.
We can say hello to, in Kiev, Peter Zalmayev, Director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative. We cross to the United States, New York to be precise, to welcome Andriy Dobryansky, Director of Communications at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. With me in the studio, Professor Andrew Wilson of the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies and Professor John Berryman, Lecturer in International Relations at Birkbeck University. I'll come to you two in just a moment. You're about to teach a class on the new Ukrainian president, so we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's go to our guests afar, first of all. And Peter, since you happen to be in Kiev, tell us about the situation in the east of the country. Is fighting still going on?
Well, it is sort of a kind of a slow burning conflict where most folks around the world and even in the capital here in Kiev have kind of tuned out, and it does not even feel that we are living in a country that has an active war with another country, a neighboring country. And yet you have one has to admit that casualties still happen, and on a weekly basis you have several soldiers on the Ukrainian side and on the other side dying. So it's still very much not a frozen conflict. It's very much a hot conflict.
Your family had to leave Donetsk, which is in the east of the country, when the fighting broke out in 2014. Do Ukrainians such as yourself and members of your family, I know they've left the country now, but would people in the west of Ukraine feel safe traveling to the east?
Absolutely not. And, personally speaking for myself, considering that I've been a very active commentator on events in Donetsk, and I've been very critical of Russia's involvement and Russia's aggression, it will not be safe for me personally to return. It will probably not be safe for members of my family to return. But if one sticks to the central parts of Donetsk, I guess it is relatively safe, all things considered.
Okay, let's get a US perspective on this. And Andriy Dobryansky in New York. What is it that Ukraine wants from President Trump that he isn't perhaps delivering at the moment?
Right now, it's the public message and the public visit, whether that's Zelensky being invited to the G7 meeting this year, seeing a little bit more presence in Ukraine. We just got that in Ukraine with Secretary Pompeo having a very successful visit in Ukraine. And they still want to see Volodymyr Zelensky inside the White House, and they'd like to see President Trump doing that same exact walk that Pompeo did, visiting all the sites of the people who were killed during this war.
Zelensky, relatively new president, you're about to go off and teach a class on him. What will be your headline to your students?
Well, we've got a virtual president, kind of actor, and Ukraine at the moment is a bit like a virtual reality movie. You have all sorts of parallel universes coexisting at the same time. You've got a push for peace at the same time as war. You've got some reforms in some sectors. You've got favours being done for oligarchs in other places. You've got a growing economy, but it's not growing as well as it should. So it's pretty hard to read him, but that's the kind of, he's not a real person. He's an actor playing.
And he was elected, so I read, ostensibly on his promise to bring peace to the country. Is there now a growing realisation that it was pretty much impossible to deliver on that?
Well, he was elected on two things, I guess. One was sort of pocketbook issues, normalcy, economic progress. The other was peace, but peace is a slogan. It's very difficult to operationalise. He has made it a priority. He's now finding out that it's pretty difficult to get the kind of humanitarian gains that he put first.
John, let me ask you this one. I've read, 14,000 people killed during the course of the last 6 years. It is not on the scale of Syria. We're not seeing street battles most of the time. Why does Ukraine matter? Is it simply because it's right next door to Russia? Is it because we see Russian aggression there? Why does it matter to the United States? Your perspective?
Well, I think it certainly matters for Russia. Ukraine has a 1,600-mile border, approximately 200 miles from Moscow, and so for Russia, its western borders have always been a very sensitive area. So for Russia, therefore, Ukraine's current position is not a very satisfactory one. The United States, it's been committed to the development of a European security framework in which NATO occupies a central role. NATO enlargement took in initially 3 states, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, then about another 10 states in Baltics and Central Asia. But the really controversial turning point came in 2008 when Georgia and Ukraine were proposed for NATO membership. And at the NATO summit in 2008, that proposal was rejected. So there is today a very deep concern in Washington that American commitments to Ukraine currently are not underpinned by NATO. And there's a question as to whether or not at some future point Ukraine and or Georgia would ever enter NATO or indeed the European Union.
And one of the concerns is at the moment Trump has been holding back military aid. This is what partly led to the impeachment trial that we saw. But in the longer term, will he deliver on more military aid for a country that he sees as a bulwark against a more imperialist Russia, or will his interest in it fade?
I think it's an interesting and contradictory question. At one level, I think it's fair to say in Moscow there's some disappointment that his more positive view towards Russia has not so far manifest. He's actually authorized military supplies to Ukraine, which Obama deliberately held back. And in other respects of sanctions, he's toughened the sanctions regime. So I think there's a worry here that, in fact, the possibilities of Trump being a peace president in the post-2020 election, which I think probably Trump is going to win, better be careful, may not turn out to be as satisfactory as maybe Russia might hope. There is one point, Surkov, who was Putin's point man from 2014 through until the present moment, has just been replaced by Dmitry Kozak. And Kozak is somebody who's handled the prisoner exchanges and some of the economic relations. And I think there is some possibility here that from the Russian side, Kozak might be a more constructive and positive figure than Surkov, who's been writing articles about Russia enjoying 1,000 years of isolation. So there's some bright spots.
I'll be back with you two in Kiev and in New York in just a moment, but I want to put this one to Andrew. We were talking there about Kozak. I don't want to go to him specifically at this point. Maybe later on we'll talk about his credentials as a peacemaker. But what about the various peace plans? The Normandy 4, that's France, Germany, Ukraine, Russia, I believe. Is that moving forward?
Well, we had a meeting in Paris with the French as hosts in December. And a second meeting is planned for Berlin in April. But it's not clear whether that will happen or whether it will happen on time. It's not clear that the Ukrainians agreed to everything in Paris that the French thought they'd agreed to. Once back in Kiev, President Zelensky was kind of reopening some basic issues, talking about security preconditions, his phrase, not one that was in the kind of communique. But he is starting to realise that there can't be the kind of autonomy status for the region or real elections in the region unless those basic security questions are decided first. And that's not really on the French agenda.
So Peter, here we are, a situation where the United States and its president has sort of got Kiev on the periphery of its interests, even though Pompeo's just been there. We've got a supposed Normandy 4 peace plan in which France and Germany have been accused of not necessarily covering the interests of Ukraine, perhaps just wanting to get it over and done with. Is the sentiment where you are in Kiev that Ukraine has been abandoned in a way?
Well, absolutely. There's a certain fatigue. We understand here in Ukraine that there's definitely a fatigue, a Ukraine fatigue. No matter how hot the conflict is, no matter how many lives are lost on a daily basis, people sort of tune out. It's an inevitable kind of trait of human character. And yes, certainly one can make an argument that from the beginning it has been Putin's calculation that the West will get used to the idea of this conflict. It will move on. It will pressure Ukraine to make concessions. And therefore, I'm very skeptical about these staff changes, notwithstanding Surkov leaving, Kozak moving in, whether that will really move the needle in terms of really putting an end to this conflict. Because Europe is itching to get this over with. European business is itching to get its contracts restored with Russia. And on the other hand, Russia wants concessions such as for Ukraine to sign off on Crimea. That's one possibility, or to federalize the whole country and to, in order to welcome the Donbass back, but on terms of significant autonomy and also with its ability to influence politics, to block its Euro integration policies, etc. Something that even the new government of Zelensky just cannot tolerate, simply because it will probably create another very serious unrest on the in sort of another Maidan in Ukraine, and Putin knows it, and he's playing a very tough game.
Okay, Andrei, I'm going to come to you. John, you were nodding in agreement with some of that. I'll come to you in just a moment. But Andrei, why concessions? And if there had to be concessions, isn't it up to Ukraine to say, look, we have to do something about this because there's no other way?
Are you asking for concessions from Ukraine? Because, from the international standpoint, Ukraine was invaded. It's not a conflict. It's not as if Ukraine came up and pushed against Russia. It's a Russia entering a foreign territory like it has in Georgia, like it has soldiers in Transnistria, like it remains intractably wedded to the Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict. It's another violation of international law that Russia continues to do. And if the international community wants to work with Russia as an equal partner, then Russia needs to align itself with some of those prescriptions. I don't know what kind of concessions Ukraine could give to a country that has invaded it, that has murdered thousands of citizens, that went ahead and shot down an airliner out of the sky with 300 innocent people that Russia will not in any way face any censure for. So concessions on Ukraine, I don't know who's asking for that other than the Russian side.
Well, but my point being that the rest of the world doesn't seem to care that much. And if Ukraine wants to get anything out of this at all, it's going to have to wait a very, very long time for Russia to back down or for anybody else to do anything meaningful about it.
I think if you look at the amount of aid that's been given to Ukraine, what has it been, 15 billion euros from the EU countries? It's been an enormous amount of aid, we're approaching $2 billion of aid from the United States as of now. Sanctions seem to be re-upped every year without fail. They haven't been diminished, the sanctions against Russia. So as far as people think there's abandonment, Well, the numbers don't really bear that out. And in the newest budget that's proposed for fiscal year 2021 by the White House, they're proposing to keep the aid exactly where it is, not diminishing it at all.
But the sanctions don't seem to be doing anything at all to bring an end to this conflict.
That's true. It is an intractable Gordian knot of a conflict. Sanctions are tied to the Minsk process. If people don't come together at Minsk, then sanctions automatically re-up. It's something that's clearly intractable. That's why it's possibly easy to get elected, as Volodymyr Zelensky was, promising peace. But the actual negotiations aren't proving to be that easy.
Okay.
Well,
Andrew,
sanctions are hurting Russia, but they take a long time to hurt. You know, pick your metaphor. One is pulling a brick across the table with a piece of elastic. You know, you start, you pull, nothing seems to be happening, and suddenly, whoosh, the brick goes. But we don't know how long it might take for Russia to get.
Or the elastic breaks.
Yeah, or the elastic, or you give up pulling.
Yeah. Let's talk about some part of the process. Sorry, John, you wanted to say something?
To come in on the question of the intractability of the Ukraine crisis. Like many other international crises, it looks very intractable. Relative, for example, to the entry of Turkish troops into Cyprus in 1974, where there are still peacekeeping lines, Ukraine is a relative newcomer to, if you like, the situation of intractability. I take the view that, in fact, there could be pressures on Ukraine to make some concessions, which it might not want to make. The EU and NATO are neither rushing forward to accelerate the possibility of entry to those organizations. And I would emphasize additionally that I think for the United States, if Trump is in power in the next 4 or 5 years, then I think the primary consideration is peer competitor China. And to that extent, American interests will switch once more away from Europe and the problems of the Ukraine to the South China Sea and contest with China.
I'm not sure I quite get this. You think one of the concessions, well, Ukraine might have to make concessions if it wanted to become a member of NATO. But if it became a member of NATO, that would be one step too far for the Russians. I misread this?
No, I'm arguing that Ukraine initially adopted, after 1992, a position of a neutral, non-aligned state. That was overturned by Yushchenko, who pushed for a NATO alignment. Yanukovych restored that adherence to a neutral position. And my view would be that it may not be a palatable one, but for Ukraine, I think a neutral, non-aligned position is going to be the only realistic way forward, and that NATO and the EU are not really on the table for the next 2 decades, maybe.
OK, we'll ask you, gentlemen, in New York and in Kiev in just a moment, whether that's something that you would consider to be acceptable. But I want to go into some of the headlines that we see, some of the phrases that we hear. I mentioned the Normandy 4, pushing for peace process named after a meeting that took place on the anniversary of the Normandy landings. What about the Steinmeier formula? Which has been named after a former German foreign minister, now president of the country, perhaps. And Zelensky was accused of humiliating Ukraine by saying that this was possibly quite acceptable. What's the story there?
Well, the problem with the Steinmeier formula is that it wouldn't work. Whatever country or forum or interest you represent, the idea is that you would prioritise the holding of elections. Right? So it pushes all the other issues like control of Ukraine's border, presence of irregular armed forces, including from foreign countries, and it doesn't address at all the existence of the rebel republics, so-called. So elections would be held under very questionable circumstances under this formula.
Well, why would Zelensky want to say that this is perhaps something that should be considered, if it is as humiliating? Poroshenko's called it humiliating, I believe it has. As humiliating as that sounds.
Well, he's a comedian. He's not necessarily that experienced in foreign policy. And the best evidence for that is that he agreed to the formula and then he immediately started redefining it, sort of walking back some of those security preconditions that we started with earlier. So he signed it, but he hasn't agreed to it.
OK. John, your thoughts on that?
No, I agree.
It is humiliating and he just realised he made a mistake?
I think he's a novice of the game, and I think he has some credentials that would suggest to me he's going to make more progress than Poroshenko. I wasn't a great fan of Poroshenko, and I think in those terms, he has more going for him.
Peter, what is the view of Zelensky where you are? I mean, he's relatively new in the presidency. Is he making any ground?
Well, believe it or not, he's been able to maintain relatively high popularity rankings. He's shown more mettle than he's been given credit for. The paramount importance is the team around him, and there's been some turmoil on the part of his staff. There's been some acrimony with the prime minister. There's the question of Mr. Kolomoisky, the oligarch, that keeps hanging over Zelensky, and one cannot ascertain still whether there's any influence that this gentleman continues to exercise over Mr. Zelensky. His major campaign promise was to disavow any connections with the oligarchs, to get rid of the oligarchs, and to institute reforms or continue on the path of reforms. We have not seen convincing evidence that this is the path that he has chosen. He has to show that there's really no connections with Kolomoisky and with others in order for public to continue to put their trust in him.
And Andrei, I mean, what is the sentiment among Ukrainian Americans about the new president? Whether he's a good conduit for peace?
I think we're still less than a year into his term of office. We'll see this year. I believe there are some local elections that they're going to schedule in Ukraine. So that's the fourth round of elections that Zelensky was hoping to have last year. But after 2 rounds of presidential elections and parliamentary elections, they begged off for another year. So we'll see how the popularity stands a full year into his presidency. It's about making sure that whoever is in charge, and again, Peter just mentioned the fact that there might be a cabinet shuffle upcoming. There's been a lot of rumors about the conflicts within President Zelensky's staff, whether it's his advisors like Yermak and Bogdan, or the cabinet administrators itself, where they start to align themselves and figure out what the path is going forward. Because he was frankly elected without really much, not that much of a platform, but more of campaign promises of doing something different, and that idea of doing something different. I think when somebody like that comes into the international affairs field, that does shake things up. I don't think that Putin still has an idea of how to deal with somebody who is half his age, somebody who has lived most of his life in a post-Soviet space, and has a different outlook on life. And President Zelensky, rightfully for Ukraine, concentrates on rebuilding the economy and less so much on the war and the conflict with another country.
Okay, so some hope there. I've got 2 questions, one for each of you. I don't know who wants to field which one, but I want to talk about Dmitry Kozak and ask whether he is his appointment is an indication that Putin actually wants to see this resolved in one way or the other. The second question is, what is it going to take, not for peace, but for this to actually become a little bit more out of control, to flare up again? Who wants to take which one? Kozak?
I'm pessimistic. I think it's nice to make a statement, so us at the round table here, that there is good prospects. But the Minsk agreements are very complex, and there's a question of procedures. And it doesn't appear to me that Kozak's going to make a tremendous difference. But it's grounds for some modest hopes. The needle might be moved a little bit.
What do you think it is going to take for this to all fall apart and to flare up again, and the situation on the ground to be as it was back in 2014-15?
Well, first on Kozak, he was originally famous for something called the Cossack Memorandum. This was a suggestion for ending the conflict in neighbouring Moldova way back in 2003. The solution would have created 2 states within a state. Technically federation, but basically a very loose confederation between the legitimate government and the rebel republic in the east. Now, in Moldova, the balance is about 2/3, 1/3. In Ukraine, these republics are less than 10%. We don't know the exact population now, but
So where
a very
does
small
Kozak fit
part,
into today, though?
a very small part of Ukraine's territory and population. So to give that area equal rights in some kind of confederal arrangement just wouldn't work.
What do you think it would take for the situation to deteriorate again, to see increasing hostilities, and for it to be much more difficult to bring about any kind of lasting solution?
Well, there's a political and a military downside. The conflict could get worse because of the failure of the political process. It could also escalate militarily. That wouldn't really be on the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians are dug in to trenches, sort of First World War style. But there are plenty of options for escalation on the Russian side. There are things that Russia isn't doing at the moment, like air power, use of missiles or whatever, or a second front. They could certainly take those options if they want to put more pressure on Ukraine.
Is there any possibility that Russia might want to increase the pressure?
Sure. It has done that periodically over the last 5 years. The whole point of the war is to bleed Ukraine of money and treasure, and sometimes Russia likes it to bleed more, if it's not cooperating.
Thank you. It's not a cheerful subject, but listen, appreciate it very much indeed. Peter and Andrei in Kiev and in New York, thank you for your time. To John and to you, Andrew, thank you very much indeed. You've been guests on this programme before. Your expertise, very much appreciated. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, thank you for watching. We hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.